Thanks. Meantime, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen going in front of the Senate Finance Committee tomorrow to answer questions about hot inflation and the toll on Americans' wallets. Just last week, Yellen admitted she was wrong about the path that she thought inflation would take. Joining us right now is Senator Bill Cassidy. He's a member of the Finance Committee. Good morning to you, Senator. What exactly do you think that you're hoping to find out from the White House, from this administration, from Janet Yellen? And what do you think is actually possible? Because we often talk about the tools that can happen politically, but really that so much of the toolkit is sitting at the Federal Reserve.
Yes, so I'm hoping that she has a plan. Wouldn't that be great? And as regards what you can do, there's some variables that you can't affect, but there's some that you can. For example, the high price of energy is driving a lot of inflation. That's a variable they can do something about. We could increase North American supply of energy by just committing to having the regulatory state work on behalf of increasing that supply as opposed to retarding that supply. If they did that, that would send a signal to the market. Futures would do better. There'd be a downward pressure. That's a good thing. And that would decrease inflation, help the pocketbook. That I want a plan, and North American energy would be a great plan to have.
Why do you look, as you know, there are so many permits now that are out there, and just contextually, because I know you've made the critique. A lot of Republicans have critiqued the Democrats. Democrats have critiqued the Republicans. You know, under Biden now, there's been more permits allowed than even under President Trump, and yet there's still not the drilling. And at least the question is, when do you think that's going to happen? What do you think is preventing that from happening?
Does anyone really think they want it to happen? Does anyone look at their regulations or the statements they're making from the regulatory state and think that the regulatory state wants this to happen? Of course, the answer is no. You've also got to permit pipelines. You've got to permit facilities to process. Until they do that, everything's kind of a stranded asset. And they've made it clear that they're not going to do that very easily. So, one, you got to start sending a different signal. Not only are we going to put this tool in place, but we're going to put everything around it that you need to do. I think the reason they're not doing it is that they've got a kind of a civil war in their administration. Those who want to leave it in the ground, so to speak, and make the American people pay more to encourage them to transition to electric vehicles, which aren't here yet, versus those who say, my gosh, inflation is sky high. We need a plan. This would be a component of a plan. Let's do it. It helps ourselves. It helps the job market. It helps our European allies. And that's not where that civil war seems to be favoring those who want to make the American people pay more.
Explain this piece of it. You know, and I totally understand the argument to drill more. The question is, can you drill fast enough to change the dynamic in terms of pricing right this minute?
So part of what you need to do is reassure the markets that there is a long-term commitment to increase supply. Now, if you do that, and then, by the way, you happen to release some crude from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, you know that the future is going to be more plentiful. There's a little bit of a downward pressure, but there's things you can do right now. We have Canadian tar sands, which cannot get to the Gulf Coast. They could replace the oil that is coming from Russia. Our Gulf Coast refineries can't refine it in an environmentally sensitive way. Let's expedite that by barge or by rail. There's other things you can do. You just got to get the regulatory state pointed in that direction. That would be a plan to lower inflation.
Senator, there seems to be two issues here. One is the regulatory state, and you can argue that this administration has not been friendly to the fossil fuel business. But on the other side, you have this investor class, and maybe there's a shift happening in the investor class. I don't know. Clearly, it started in Europe, came to the United States, this focus on ESG. This has happened not just from the likes of BlackRock and others, but pension funds, various cities that have either divested from fossil fuels and the like. What do you do about those, what might be described as free market pressures? And you may take issue with that.
No, well, I think that if you look at that period where there was less investment, it's because the stock for these companies was not doing well. There was, after COVID, there was demand destruction, and no one was flying, less driving. So at some point, the price of oil coming out of West Texas was negative. The producers had to pay people to take their oil. That was then, this is now. So now you have where there is increased demand, and there will be increased demand for some time. You see Venture Global, for example, making I think a $21 billion investment, or maybe $13 billion, to make an LNG export facility to ship to EU. So clearly there is going to be demand going forward. Now the administration needs to kind of, okay, capital markets, we want you to develop this in an environmentally sensitive way, but it creates American jobs, it helps inflation, helps our national security. Let's do it.
Hey, Senator, while I have you, I want to ask you about gun control, but in the context of business. And the reason I wanted to ask you is there are a number of businesses that have made decisions about financing or not financing gun makers, gun manufacturers. There's been a conversation about whether banks should step in and be involved in some form of effectively not background checks, but being able to try to avoid letting these guns into the hands of the wrong people. And there's been a huge pushback, specifically in the Republican Party, against any business that has spoken out on this issue. And I'm curious whether you think that that's appropriate.
I think it's a really kind of scary situation when people are making investment decisions against disfavored industry. Now, you can say, oh, it doesn't matter. Guns, we don't like it. You know, if someone doesn't like guns, that's okay. But what if it's something else going forward? It turns out guns are actually legal. And so if you're deciding that you wish to punish an industry, which there's more than one gun per American in the United States, which is not to condone inappropriate use or illegal use, but just to acknowledge, but you're going to punish that industry, that's some kind of an odd sort of way to approach business.
Should businesses speak out on these issues? And mind you, I should tell you that there's a situation in Florida. I'd actually love to get your thought on it, which is the Governor DeSantis. There had been some money allotted for a baseball team down there that was effectively taken back, or at least reportedly taken back, because that baseball team spoke out and said in favor of gun safety. And so how government now is using its power, and obviously on the other side there's votes, obviously business is using its voice, but whether they should be used like this.
Well, so now you've brought up a sticky wicket, right? If business attempts to go into that sort of statement industry, you kind of accept the blowback. We've seen that routinely from the left. California would say that their public employees could not travel to states who didn't do something according to the ethics of California. And so it then kind of becomes a tit for tat. By the way, we can see where it kind of happens. You mentioned earlier how ESG wanted to punish fossil fuel. Now we end up with a market distortion where we have inadequate fossil fuel resources. Europe is vulnerable to Russia, and the consumer in the United States is paying more at the pump and more for her utility bill. And so there's also market distortions that occur that end up coming back and hurting the economy overall. I'm a little bit more of kind of everybody stay in their lane, and I think everyone does better.
Senator Cassidy, we want to thank you for joining us this morning. Appreciate it very, very much.
Hey, thank you.